August 15th, 1955. Marfa, Texas. The giant film set bakes under the merciless West Texas sun. Inside the air-conditioned production trailer, 30-year-old Rock Hudson sits across from director George Stevens, his famous composure finally shattered. Rock's hands shake slightly as he lights another cigarette, his third in 10 minutes. His voice, usually smooth and controlled, carries an edge of desperation that shocks Stevens. "George, I can't work with him," Rock says, exhaling smoke through clenched teeth. "That kid isn't acting. He's having a goddamn breakdown every single scene, and I can't take it anymore." He's talking about James Dean. 24 years old, fresh off East of Eden, cast as Jet Rink in what should be the performance that establishes him as a serious actor. Instead, James Dean is destroying himself in front of the cameras. And Rock Hudson, Hollywood's golden boy, the epitome of professional calm, has reached his breaking point. "He's not playing Jet Rink," Rock continues, voice rising. "He's playing his own trauma. Every time the cameras roll, he turns into that 9-year-old boy whose mother died. I'm not acting opposite James Dean. I'm acting opposite a mental patient." The meeting that would change how Hollywood understood the dangerous intersection of method acting and unresolved psychological trauma. The moment when one of the industry's biggest stars demanded protection from a colleague he'd initially admired but had come to fear. What had James Dean done to drive Rock Hudson, a man famous for his patience and professionalism, to the point of near panic? The answer reveals the darkest chapter of James Dean's brief career, when his mother complex became so severe that it poisoned every relationship on one of the biggest film productions of 1955. This is the untold story of how James Dean's unhealed wounds turned a prestigious film set into a psychological battlefield, and how his desperate search for a mother figure drove one of Hollywood's most beloved stars to demand his removal from the project. To understand why Rock Hudson feared James Dean, you need to understand what happened during the first week of giant filming. James arrived in Texas carrying more psychological baggage than anyone realized. He was still reeling from Pier Angeli's brutal rejection, still haunted by her words, "You love your mother's ghost." He had just finished the traumatic experience on Rebel Without a Cause, where his inappropriate behavior toward Natalie Wood had created a scandal that Warner Brothers barely managed to contain. But more than that, James was struggling with the role of Jet Rink itself. On paper, it seemed perfect for him. The poor ranch hand who strikes oil and becomes wealthy, but remains emotionally empty. But Jet's relationship with the Leslie Benedict character, played by Elizabeth Taylor, triggered every aspect of James's mother complex. Leslie was older, sophisticated, nurturing, everything that reminded James of the maternal love he'd lost at age 9. George Stevens had cast James precisely because of his emotional intensity. But he had no idea that James was incapable of distinguishing between his personal trauma and his character's emotions. When James looked at Elizabeth Taylor's Leslie Benedict, he didn't see a character. He saw Mildred Dean, the mother he'd lost 15 years earlier. Rock Hudson, meanwhile, was at the height of his career. 30 years old, devastatingly handsome, with a string of successful films behind him and a carefully crafted public image as Hollywood's perfect leading man. He was professional, reliable, beloved by crews and co-stars alike. Rock had worked with difficult actors before, but nothing had prepared him for James Dean. From their first scene together, Rock sensed something was wrong with his young co-star. James wasn't hitting his marks, wasn't responding to direction, seemed to be performing some entirely different movie than the one they were shooting. During a crucial scene where Jet Rink confronts Bick Benedict about class and privilege, James began improvising dialogue that had nothing to do with the script. "You don't understand what it's like," James said, staring at Rock with an intensity that made the veteran actor uncomfortable. "You had everything handed to you. You never lost anyone. You never had to watch someone you loved die slowly, while you couldn't do anything to save them." The words weren't Jet Rink's. They were James Dean's, pulled directly from his childhood trauma. Rock, trying to stay in character as Bick Benedict, responded with his scripted lines, but James kept going, tears streaming down his face, completely lost in his own psychological pain. "Cut!" Stevens called, but James didn't stop. He kept talking, kept crying, reliving his mother's death in front of 40 crew members who watched in uncomfortable silence. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. If you think so too, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Rock Hudson later told his close friends that watching James in that moment was like witnessing someone having a psychotic break. "He wasn't acting," Rock said. "He was hemorrhaging his own pain all over the set and expecting us all to just pretend it was professional." The situation escalated during the filming of scenes between James and Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth, then 23 and already an established star, was playing Leslie Benedict, the sophisticated Eastern woman who becomes the object of Jet Rink's obsession. The dynamic between Leslie and Jet was meant to be about class conflict and unrequited love, but James transformed it into something far more disturbing. During their first major scene together, James began relating to Elizabeth not as Jet relating to Leslie, but as a son seeking maternal comfort from a mother figure. He would touch her arm with desperate need, look at her with the kind of longing that suggested he was seeing someone else entirely, speak his lines with an emotional intensity that had nothing to do with the script and everything to do with his unresolved grief. Elizabeth, sophisticated and psychologically astute, recognized what was happening immediately. She had worked with method actors before, but James's behavior was something else entirely. He wasn't accessing emotions for his character. He was using the character as an excuse to process his own trauma without any professional boundaries. "He would look at me like I was his mother," Elizabeth later confided to Rock. "Not like Jet looking at Leslie, but like a lost child looking for his mother." It was heartbreaking and terrifying at the same time. Rock watched this dynamic develop with growing alarm. He could see that James was projecting his mother complex onto Elizabeth, just as he had done with Pier Angeli and Natalie Wood. But unlike those previous situations, this was happening in the middle of a major film production, with millions of dollars at stake and dozens of people depending on the project's success. The breaking point came during the filming of the famous restaurant scene, where an older Jet Rink, now wealthy but still obsessed with Leslie, makes a drunken speech. The scene was meant to show Jet's pathetic decline, but James transformed it into something so psychologically raw that it disturbed everyone present. As Jet, James was supposed to deliver a speech about lost opportunities and faded dreams. Instead, he began talking about his mother, about loss, about the emptiness that comes from loving someone who can never love you back. The words weren't in the script, but they poured out of James with such devastating honesty that Stevens kept the cameras rolling, thinking he was witnessing brilliant improvisation. But Rock, watching from the sidelines, recognized what was really happening. James wasn't creating art. He was having a breakdown. The young actor stood swaying slightly, tears streaming down his face, talking to Elizabeth Taylor as if she were the ghost of Mildred Dean. I loved her so much, James whispered, completely off script. She left me when I was just a kid. Everyone always leaves. Why does everyone always leave? Elizabeth, trapped in the scene, tried to respond as Leslie, but James grabbed her hands with desperate intensity, holding them like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. "Don't leave me," he pleaded. "Please don't leave me like she did." The entire set fell silent. James stood there, holding Elizabeth's hands, sobbing openly, lost in a psychological space that had nothing to do with filmmaking and everything to do with unprocessed trauma. Stevens finally called cut, but James didn't respond. He just stood there, clinging to Elizabeth, crying for the mother he'd lost 15 years earlier. Rock Hudson watched this scene unfold with a mixture of horror and fury. He had spent years building his reputation as a consummate professional, and now he was watching his co-star turn a film set into group therapy. More than that, he could see how James's behavior was affecting Elizabeth, who looked genuinely frightened by the intensity of his need and the impossibility of providing what he was seeking. That night, Rock went to George Stevens' trailer and delivered the ultimatum that would change the entire production. "I can't work with him," Rock said bluntly. "That kid isn't acting. He's using this movie to work through his psychological problems, and I won't be part of it." Stevens, who had been struggling with James's behavior himself, tried to defend his casting choice. "He's got incredible intensity, Rock. That emotion you're seeing, it's what makes him special." "It's not emotion," Rock replied sharply. "It's pathology. He's not creating a character. He's bleeding all over the set. And it's not fair to Elizabeth, it's not fair to the crew, and it's not fair to me. I didn't sign up to be in some kid's therapy session." Rock's frustration went beyond professional concerns, though he couldn't articulate it at the time. As a gay man in 1955 Hollywood, Rock lived every day in careful control of his public image, maintaining strict boundaries between his private self and his professional persona. Watching James Dean completely abandon all psychological boundaries, using his trauma as performance material, felt like a violation of everything Rock had learned about survival in Hollywood. "He has no control," Rock told Stevens. "No boundaries, no sense of what's appropriate and what isn't. He thinks because he's in pain, he can inflict that pain on everyone around him. That's not art, George. That's selfishness." Stevens found himself in an impossible position. James Dean was undeniably talented, and the raw footage from his scenes was unlike anything Stevens had ever captured. But Rock Hudson was the film's anchor, the bankable star who guaranteed the movie's commercial success. Losing Rock would mean losing the film. After several tense meetings with the studio executives, Stevens developed a strategy to manage James without removing him from the project. Strict boundaries were established. James was forbidden from improvising dialogue that related to his personal life. A psychiatric consultant was brought to the set, ostensibly to help with character development, but really to monitor James's psychological state. Most importantly, Rock Hudson's scenes with James were limited and carefully structured to minimize the potential for emotional chaos. These measures helped stabilize the production, but they also created a new set of problems. James, cut off from his usual emotional outlets, became increasingly erratic in other areas. He began drinking heavily, engaging in dangerous stunts with his cars, and alienating other cast and crew members with his unpredictable behavior. Rock, meanwhile, found himself in the strange position of having to protect not only himself, but also Elizabeth Taylor and the other actors from James's psychological projections. He began arriving early to discuss scenes with Stevens, strategizing ways to keep James focused on the script rather than his personal trauma. Working with James Dean was like working with a lit stick of dynamite, Rock later told his biographer. You never knew when he was going to explode, and you couldn't predict what would set him off. The worst part was that he thought his instability made him a better actor. He had no idea how selfish and destructive he was being. The tension between Rock and James affected every aspect of the giant production. Their scenes together, which should have crackled with the energy of two charismatic actors, instead felt strained and artificial. Rock's natural warmth was replaced by careful distance, while James's intensity became increasingly desperate and unfocused. Elizabeth Taylor, caught between the two men, tried to mediate, but she soon realized that the conflict was about more than professional differences. Rock represented everything James feared he could never become: stable, successful, professionally respected, while James represented everything Rock had learned to suppress about himself. Raw emotion, vulnerability, the willingness to risk everything for authentic expression. They were like opposite sides of the same coin, Elizabeth later observed. Rock had learned to hide all his pain behind professionalism, while James couldn't hide anything. Neither approach was completely healthy, but James's way was destroying everyone around him. The psychological pressure of the situation began to affect James's performance in ways that went beyond his usual method acting techniques. He started missing his marks, forgetting his lines, and responding to directions with hostility that bordered on paranoia. Stevens found himself spending hours each day managing James's emotional state rather than directing a movie. The crisis reached its peak during the filming of the final confrontation scene between Jet Rink and Bick Benedict. The scene called for Jet, now old and bitter, to face off against Bick in a moment of mutual recognition and resigned hostility. It should have been a powerful culmination of their characters' lifelong conflict. Instead, James used the scene as an opportunity to confront Rock directly about what he perceived as rejection and abandonment. Speaking Jet's lines but using his own emotions, James accused Rock of being cold, heartless, unwilling to understand the pain of those who had suffered real loss. "You think you're better than me," James said, his voice breaking with genuine anguish. "You think because you're successful, because you fit in, because you never lost anyone, you're somehow superior. But you're just scared. You're just hiding behind your perfect image because you're terrified of feeling anything real. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support means everything to us." Rock, startled by the personal attack disguised as dialogue, responded with Bick's scripted lines, but his voice carried an edge of real anger. "Maybe some of us learn to grow up instead of wallowing in self-pity." The words weren't in the script, but they hit James like a physical blow. For a moment, the careful boundary between performance and reality completely dissolved. James stared at Rock with naked hurt, and Rock stared back with barely concealed fury. Stevens, sensing that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control, called cut immediately, but the damage was done. James walked off the set without a word, and Rock sat in his chair, shaking with rage and exhaustion. That night, Rock made a decision that would affect the rest of James Dean's brief career. He called his agent and delivered an ultimatum. He would never work with James Dean again, and he would advise other major stars to avoid him as well. James's reputation as a difficult, unprofessional actor began that night in a Texas hotel room when Rock Hudson decided that talent wasn't worth the psychological cost. Within weeks of Rock's ultimatum, word spread through Hollywood that James Dean was impossible to work with. Directors who had been interested in casting him began having second thoughts. Studio executives started questioning whether his talent justified the disruption he caused on sets. James, sensing his isolation but unable to understand its source, became increasingly desperate in his final months. He took unnecessary risks, drove recklessly, and engaged in behavior that suggested he was actively courting death. Some who knew him believed that Rock Hudson's rejection was the final blow that convinced James he would never be accepted in Hollywood, never find the professional family he desperately needed. When James died on September 30th, 1955, just weeks after Giant finished filming, Rock felt a complex mixture of relief and guilt. He had gotten what he wanted, freedom from James's psychological chaos, but at the ultimate cost. In later interviews, Rock spoke about James Dean with a mixture of admiration and regret that revealed how deeply the experience had affected him. "James had more raw talent than anyone I ever worked with," Rock said in 1980. "But he also had more pain than anyone should have to carry. He couldn't separate his art from his life, and that made him dangerous to everyone around him, including himself." The story of Rock Hudson's confrontation with James Dean reveals the dark side of method acting when practiced by someone with severe unresolved trauma. James's inability to maintain professional boundaries didn't just make him difficult to work with. It made him actively harmful to the psychological well-being of his colleagues. For Rock Hudson, the experience with James Dean was a harsh lesson about the responsibility that actors have to manage their own psychological health before attempting to create art from their pain. Rock's demand for professional boundaries wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting the integrity of the collaborative art form that filmmaking represents. The tragedy is that James Dean's talent was undeniable, but his psychological dysfunction made that talent impossible to harness in a healthy way. His death at 24 preserved him as a legend, but it also ended any possibility that he might have learned to transform his pain into art without destroying everyone around him in the process. Rock Hudson carried the guilt of that Texas confrontation for the rest of his life, wondering if he could have done something different, if he could have found a way to help rather than simply protect himself. But those who knew both men understood that Rock's reaction was not just understandable, but necessary. Sometimes survival requires recognizing when someone else's wounds have become toxic, and having the courage to walk away before you become another casualty. The Giant set became the final proof that James Dean's mother complex had evolved from personal tragedy into professional liability. His desperate search for maternal figures had poisoned his relationship with Piera Angeli, terrorized Natalie Wood, and finally driven away Rock Hudson, one of the most patient and professional actors of his generation. In the end, Rock Hudson's rage wasn't really about James Dean's acting methods or his unprofessionalism. It was about watching a talented young man slowly destroy himself, while demanding that everyone around him participate in his self-destruction. Rock's refusal to enable James's psychological dysfunction was an act of self-preservation. But it was also the beginning of the end for James Dean's Hollywood career. The boy who had lost his mother at 9 never learned to stop looking for her in the faces of everyone he met. And when those people inevitably failed to become the impossible thing he needed them to be, his disappointment turned to rage, his rage to recklessness, and his recklessness to death on a highway in California, just weeks after Rock Hudson told the world that James Dean was too dangerous to work with. James Dean lived only 24 years, but those years were filled with stories the world never heard. Stories of love, pain, rebellion, dreams that died too soon. This channel exists to tell those stories, to remember not just the icon, but the man. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe, because James Dean's story isn't over. Not yet.